Hello, students. Welcome to our channel, Grade 10 History, Unit 2 Tutorials. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos. Lesson 1. Introduction to Colonialism. Colonialism is an important part of world history because it has shaped nations, economies, and societies across the globe. It refers to a situation in which one country takes control over another country. This control is not limited to government and politics. It also extends to the economy, culture, and even the daily lives of the people being ruled. The stronger country, known as the colonizer, uses its power to rule the weaker one, called the colony, and takes advantage of its land, labor, and natural resources for its own benefit. Colonialism is closely connected to the idea of imperialism. Imperialism is the belief or policy that powerful nations have the right to expand their influence and dominate weaker nations. In practice, colonialism is the tool through which imperialism is carried out. Although colonialism became very powerful in modern times, it is not a new idea. It has existed for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and Ottomans created colonies in different regions of the world. However, colonialism became stronger and more global after the 16th century, during the Age of Discovery. This was the period when European nations, using improved navigational tools and stronger ships, began traveling across oceans to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They established trading posts, settlements, and colonies that changed the course of history. In this lesson, we will carefully examine the meaning of colonialism, the main motives behind European colonial rule in Africa, and the key events that led to colonization of the continent. 1. The meaning of colonialism. Colonialism is the direct and complete dominance of one country by another. It occurs when a nation conquers another, rules over it, and uses its resources and people for its own benefit. This relationship is never equal because it is built on force, control, and exploitation. Unlike normal trade or cultural exchange, colonialism denies freedom and independence to the colonized people. 2. Early relations between Africa and Europe. Africa's relationship with Europe began long before colonialism. For centuries, there were exchanges of goods across the Mediterranean and along the coasts. However, during the Atlantic slave trade, millions of Africans were captured and sold into slavery across the Atlantic, mainly to the Americas. This trade caused immense suffering and depopulation in Africa. When the slave trade was officially abolished in the 19th century, Europeans introduced a new system known as legitimate trade. Under this system, instead of trading people, Africans exchanged raw materials such as palm oil, ivory, gold, and agricultural crops with Europeans. In return, they received goods like cloth, metal, and firearms. 3. From legitimate trade to competition. At first, legitimate trade seemed like a fairer and more positive form of exchange compared to slavery. However, in reality, it only increased Europe's hunger for Africa's resources. Europeans soon realized that Africa was rich in raw materials that could fuel their growing industries. They also saw Africa as a market for selling manufactured goods. This discovery encouraged competition among European countries such as Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal. Each of these powers wanted to secure African territories for themselves. They competed fiercely because controlling more land meant access to more resources, stronger markets, and greater political influence. 4. The scramble for Africa. This rivalry resulted in the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. During this period, European nations rushed to claim territories across the continent. Within only a few decades, nearly the entire African continent was divided into colonies. The process was made official during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European leaders gathered to set the rules for dividing Africa. Africans themselves were not invited to this meeting, and their wishes were completely ignored. The result was the loss of African independence and sovereignty. 5. The role of explorers and missionaries. Explorers and missionaries also contributed to colonialism. Between the late 18th century and the 1870s, explorers traveled deep into Africa. Those who came before the 1850s often said they were motivated by scientific curiosity, studying rivers, plants, animals, and people. After the 1850s, however, many explorers acted as agents of European governments. They mapped African territories, reported on valuable resources, and prepared the way for colonization. Missionaries also played an important role. Their goal was to spread Christianity and promote ideas of civilization and commerce. Missionaries often worked alongside colonial administrators and traders. They relied on traders for money and supplies, and on European governments for protection. However, their success in converting Africans was limited. By the end of the 19th century, less than 1% of non-Muslim Africans outside Ethiopia had converted to Christianity. Because of this, missionaries began appealing to their home governments for stronger support, which in turn strengthened colonial rule. 6. Consequences of colonization. What began as trade eventually turned into domination. African societies lost control of their land, resources, and political systems. Traditional leaders were weakened or removed, while European laws and governments took their place. Economies were reshaped to serve European interests, and African labor was exploited. Social and cultural life was also affected, as European languages, religions, and values were introduced, often at the expense of African traditions. In summary, we learned that colonialism means the domination of one country by another through political, economic, and social control. Although colonialism has existed since ancient times, it expanded greatly after the 16th century with European exploration. In Africa, the shift from the slave trade to legitimate trade at first seemed positive, but it only increased Europe's desire to control resources. This competition led to the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, where European powers divided the continent at the Berlin Conference without considering African people. Explorers and missionaries also played a role in preparing the ground for colonization, even if unintentionally. The final result was a complete loss of African independence, the exploitation of resources, and major changes in African societies. By the end of this lesson, we can define colonialism, describe the motives of European colonial rule in Africa, and identify the major events that led to colonization. Understanding this history is important because it helps us see how colonialism shaped the modern world and left lasting effects on Africa. Review questions. 1. What is colonialism, and how is it different from normal trade or cooperation? Answer. Colonialism is the complete domination of one country by another, where the stronger nation controls the politics, economy, and society of the weaker one. It is different from normal trade or cooperation because it is based on force, unequal power, and exploitation. 2. What was legitimate trade, and why did it increase European interest in Africa? Answer. Legitimate trade was the exchange of goods between Africans and Europeans after the abolition of the slave trade. Africans sold raw materials such as palm oil, ivory, gold, and cash crops in return for European goods. It increased European interest because it revealed Africa's vast natural wealth, which Europeans wanted to control directly. 3. What was the scramble for Africa, and how was it formalized? Answer. The scramble for Africa was the period in the late 19th century when European nations rushed to claim African territories. It was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European leaders agreed on rules for dividing Africa without considering the views of African people. 4. How did explorers and missionaries contribute to European colonial rule in Africa? Answer. Explorers mapped territories, identified resources, and reported valuable information to European governments, preparing the way for colonization. Missionaries spread Christianity and European values, and though they had limited success, They often worked with traders and colonial administrators and appealed to European governments for support, which indirectly strengthened colonial rule. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos.